And it wanted to touch a little bit on the contract. We didn't, when is that up? How does that work?
So in terms of the contract, it's a 5-year contract. We have 2 years remaining on the contract. The way it was designed, it was a best efforts clause in the contract that the fleet be completely outfitted by the vendor. And as stated previously, that will be done prior to the beginning of the school year. So we have 2 years left on this current contract, and then we're actually going into negotiations with them very soon.
Okay. Councilmember Hucker, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Guys, thanks for being here and everything you're doing to keep our kids safe. I think we all agree with the goal. Years ago, I sponsored legislation to authorize this in Annapolis, and we're still not nearly as far along as I think any of us want to be. But with the Inspector General report out, I wanted to get your comments on that since we're all here. Clearly, when you read it, I think any of us would have concerns about the decision making and the content of the contract as it's described in the IG report. So I'm not sure who to address it to. Maybe you, Tom, but or Todd, I guess. Do you have a comment on first? The finding one is that, quote, the business case for the program was built around the desired use of a predetermined vendor rather than an objective analysis to design an effective and economical method to achieve an identified outcome.
So I think when we were working with Xerox on doing the pilot program, we were intrigued by Force Multiplier Solutions' whole fleet concept, right? Their business model. We wanted every student, whether they have a stop on Colesville Road or whether they have one back in Councilmember Rice's neighborhood, we wanted all the students to have the same protection. And Force Multiplier Solutions was the only camera enforcement company that came anywhere close to a whole fleet solution. Most of the rest wanted to do the top 10 or 20% of your buses that get the most violations, and to us that seemed like a very economic decision, and it did not strike a good balance between the economics for the vendor and safety for the children. And so that's what made us look at Force Multiplier Solutions was their whole fleet model. Okay. They were the only ones that we found.
They also say the contract requires the county to remit 100% of the fines received until such time that the contractor recovers the costs of the initial and ongoing capital investment. I remember discussions of this in earlier committee meetings, but it says, I think unbeknownst to us then, the contract reveals that the cost of investment estimate is $1 million a year in operating costs, and so the IG believes it's possible we may never fully recover the contractor's costs, and that the $1 million a year fee will be on top of any revenue splitting agreement in the future.
So if I can just talk a little bit about that. Now,
sure.
Bear in mind that, MCPS is part of the contract. We have an MOU with MCPS for the enforcement side of things. And I would just remind everybody that there's a purpose for that. These are their buses. This is their program. But again, I go back to what I said earlier. We approached MCPS about this program as a matter of public policy, public safety. And when we look at this and when we look at the contract, remember, there's a cost to all the internal cameras that go on those buses, hundreds of thousands of dollars that go into that. There's a cost to install those cameras. Those costs were being paid for by the revenue of this program. Right. So it was self-sufficient. The speculation of the IG's report, I can't speak to because it's speculation. What I can tell you is that we are currently going up into negotiations. We have an audit underway, which the vendor is completely understanding of, so we can go into determining and verifying the financials that we have right now as we would compare them and start looking at them when we start talking about negotiating any type of a revenue share. When you look at the IG's report, that's a big focus of the report, is the lack of a rev share in the original contract. But if you also read the contract, it talks about the parties reconvening and beginning to have that negotiation, and that is it is a cost recovery. It did a couple of things. One, Todd already mentioned, and that is it gave the ability for the vendor to be able to reinvest that revenue to now outfit more buses more rapidly. And I said it earlier, this vendor, it was a best efforts clause. They had to make best efforts to outfit the entire fleet. you heard earlier that when we install the cameras, we're installing it to the whole fleet. So there's a diminished return on those last cameras that we're putting in, but the vendor's been committed to putting them in.
I understand the need for cost recovery, and we've discussed that. So this was based on the contract with the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board, but the IG says the EBRPSB program is structured quite differently and results in, they get immediate ticket revenue for the school board and the sheriff's office, but we don't.
So again, and I don't know that contract other than what I've read in the IG report. I can tell you that when the parties met, when MCPS and MCPD, MCG representatives met with the vendor, we thought this was a fair arrangement, that because it was going to be a cost recovery, there was going to be a break-even point, and again, we're in an audit right now to make sure we understand what those numbers are. And then from that point forward, there would be a revenue sharing negotiation about what that split's going to look like in the future. We're on the eve of that right now.
Right.
So it's a little tough to talk about, what could have been and what's going to be, because that's where we are. I mean, we're on the cusp of those negotiations right now.
You believe it's clear who's going to own the cameras when the costs are recovered?
So I do, and then if I can talk I'd like to talk about some of this in a closed session. Remember, we have other vendors that are watching this right now to try and figure out. We have 2 years left on this contract, and
I think that would be reasonable. Yeah, you'd be
fine.
fine with that. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Did you?
I appreciate the questioning, trying to dive into the details of the contract and making sure that it is good for the taxpayers of Montgomery County. But ultimately, what we're talking about for everybody who has received a fine and received a ticket, it's not about the money being a revenue generator. It's about the money. It's not about the money being a revenue generator. It is about the public safety for all of our students. And so there might be a cost in that we have to pay for all of these systems to make sure that our roads are safe for our school students.
And if I can just dovetail on that, unfortunately, we've had some very high-profile criminal acts with students as victims. And this camera system, it's a system. Our camera that we saw earlier is just one part of that system. This system captured those acts and are going to put people in prison for victimizing children. So thank you very much for making your point.
Right. Valid point. Is there anything, I was going to go make certain that we got all these questions.
We have covered everything and more.
Okay. Hard to believe. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Anything else from the? No, thank you. Thank you all very, very much for being here. We appreciate all that you're doing. Thank you.